Despite torrential downpours, many logistical hurdles, and a rogue New Zealander spoiling the show, the Chicago street race was heralded as one of NASCAR's greatest modern achievements. But even after a successful first year, street racing in NASCAR, especially in Chicago, is still considered a highly controversial subject. So here's why we may not be staying on the streets of Chicago for long. But first, a special announcement: we're going to be at Chicago this weekend, on an actual race car. That's right, this channel has partnered with Opticare Ceramic Coating to design the number 6 Chevy for none other than road course ringer Thomas Annunziata. If you didn't see the video we did earlier this week on Thomas, then be sure to go check it out. He has an amazing story. And it's not just us, Break Hard and Ellie Productions will also be along for the ride, so keep an eye out for them in this weekend's Xfinity race. And be sure to also give Thomas a follow. He's on Instagram and TikTok. Oh, and one more thing, for you serious collectors out there, we have a super cool item to show off at the end of this video, so stick around for that. First, to understand Chicago's relationship with NASCAR, we first need to understand the city's more broad history with sports. You may be surprised to find this out, but despite Chicago being a massive sports town, it's actually had a pretty rocky history with a lot of them. Only a few years back, Wrigley Field, one of baseball's oldest and most iconic venues, was on the verge of demise after debates between the owners and the city. The city was apprehensive to save this landmark. This started long ago when the Cubs became more successful and night games became more of the norm. Local residents were strongly against the installation of lights at Wrigley Field in the 80s, and while they eventually happened, it set the tone that any time alterations were to be made to the stadium, the neighborhood and Chicago by extension would resist. Meanwhile, Chicago's other baseball team, the White Sox, have also struggled to secure funding from the city to build a new stadium, and they've even threatened to move to new cities in the past because of the little amount of financial support the city gives them. The Chicago Bears football team has also struggled to secure funding from the city for renovations in recent years. So if the city of Chicago is unwilling to help out their own baseball and football teams, which drive far more traffic and tourism than any other sport, why would they be willing to help NASCAR in the long term? Well, the street race did generate a ton of revenue for the city, even with the largely unfavorable weather conditions. The city did have to spend an estimated $3.5 million to set up and deconstruct the street course, which is no small number, but the race was estimated to generate about $109 million, so that's still a $106 million profit. Pretty good if you ask me, even if it was slightly below the $114 million projection that NASCAR promised the city. Again, nobody could have anticipated a literal hurricane forming the weekend of the race, except NASCAR fans who have come to expect this sort of thing. Another thing to consider is the political aspect of all this. Lori Lightfoot was the previous mayor of Chicago who approved the street race, and from what I can gather, she was not a very well-liked mayor, which is why she's also now the former mayor. Now, Brandon Johnson, no relation to Jimmy, is the current mayor of Chicago. And while he did approve the second running of the Chicago street race, he essentially inherited the plan from the previous mayor. So it's still pretty uncertain if this is an operation that he'd like to keep going in the near future. I think now is probably a good time to shed some light on what NASCAR's contract looks like with the city of Chicago. Reportedly, NASCAR and the city made a 3-year deal, racing in 2023, 2024, and 2025. However, the city of Chicago has the option to pull off the schedule with at least 180 days notice, which is likely why the 2024 schedule took so long to release last year, if you recall that entire saga. Basically, while a deal is in place, it's entirely possible for Chicago's current mayor to just go, nah, never mind, and the whole thing is kaput. And this is where NASCAR may want to look for a city with a bit more political stability. Maybe somewhere that is willing to give them a more solid deal so they won't have to scramble to put a new race in the schedule in the event that Chicago pulls out. This may be the reason why Chicagoland Speedway has undergone some minor renovations recently. In the event that Chicago does cancel the street race, NASCAR can just go an hour down the road to Joliet and run the race there instead. Although NASCAR hasn't raced at Chicagoland since 2019, NASCAR does still own the facility and will be hosting the Super Motocross World Championships there later this year. At first, it seemed like the track was going to be demolished because the land was too valuable, but those plans seem to have fallen through, at least for now. Which brings me to the next pillar of this controversy, the fan sentiment. Before it was taken off the schedule, Chicagoland had become a fan-favorite racetrack, and that was even in the middle of the terrible, low-horsepower Gen 6 racing. It was one of the few intermediates that still managed to put on a good show, with the surface being even more worn out now and the next gen performing amazingly on mile-and-a-half tracks. Chicagoland is practically begging to be put back on the schedule. It could very well produce some of the best racing of the year. Meanwhile, fans kinda expect lackluster racing on the streets. The next-gen car and its many road course struggles aside, most fans are aware of the fact that street racing is more about the spectacle rather than the racing product itself, and so I have to wonder, when that spectacle wears off, will fans still turn out for subpar racing? Now, I know, last year's race was surprisingly good, but I think that had more to do with the rain tires than anything. Put them on their regular slicks, and I bet you that might have been the worst race of the year. Maybe I'll eat my words this weekend, but we'll see. And we've seen in recent years just how reactionary NASCAR can be with the schedule. 1 or 2 duds, and you might be kissing your only race date goodbye. This isn't like the 2000s and 2010s where the schedule stayed the same year after year after year. They are very aggressive when it comes to shifting dates around now, especially if the racing isn't up to code. Rest in peace, Richmond, you are probably the next one to lose a date. And beyond just regular race fans, think about the locals. While the people who went to the Chicago street race had a great time last year, there were still many complaints from the residents of the city who found the street race to be a pretty large annoyance. I mean, shutting down a major travel area in a downtown is one thing, but to do it during a major holiday weekend? This is the next thing to consider. I know NASCAR wants to build another iconic 4th of July tradition, one that can maybe rival the old Firecracker 400 at Daytona, even though that's probably not happening. But is street racing really that holiday tradition that they need? This isn't even a Chicago-specific issue. I think any city would struggle with the idea of shutting down a large portion of downtown during one of America's greatest travel weekends. The logistics just aren't great for a lot of people involved, which is why I don't know if we'll ever see a good long-term venue for street racing. It's a big commitment, there's a lot of sacrifice involved. Sure, it can make you a lot of money, but it can make a lot of people mad in the process. Not only that, but it seems like there are cities that are way more into the idea of a NASCAR street race than Chicago. The city of Pittsburgh, for example, has been lobbying to get NASCAR on the streets since street racing was just a rumor a few years ago. Ben Kennedy has even said that he's not exactly committed to the city of Chicago and that NASCAR wants to experiment with moving it around to markets like the Pacific Northwest, Denver, or even places outside of the US like Canada, Mexico, or the Middle East. How are you going to send 36 race cars overseas right smack in the middle of the NASCAR season? I don't know, that's for somebody smarter than me to figure out, but hey, F1 makes it work. Point is, there's a lot of competition from cities that would pay NASCAR a lot of money to come there. Whereas Chicago feels kinda wishy-washy. We already went over the whole mayor situation and how long it took them to commit to year 2. It just doesn't feel like they're fully sold on the idea of making street racing a permanent event. Again, I doubt any venue would be permanent. I think NASCAR wants to keep this thing rotating and going into new markets. But again, if some place offered them more stability, I'm sure they would jump at the chance. But while we've discussed mostly negatives around the Chicago street race in this video, there were also a ton of positives. Like I mentioned, they generated $100 million in revenue, despite the absurd weather conditions. NASCAR and NBC got 4.5 million viewers that turned into a rain-delayed race. It was the most watched NASCAR race on NBC since the 2017 championship, and it was second only to the Daytona 500 last year. I'm sure TV networks want street racing to continue if they put up huge numbers like that, regardless of where it is. Sports Business Journal even gave last year's street race the Sports Award of the Year. There was a ton of positive buzz that came from this race, against all the odds. So despite all the controversies, I'm pretty convinced that street racing is here to stay in NASCAR, so we may as well embrace it. Will it stay in Chicago past next year? And that part I kinda doubt. Does that mean we might get Chicagoland back at some point? That also seems like more of a pipe dream, but I suppose anything's possible. We did get North Wilkesboro back. So where do you fall on the Chicago street racing issue? Let me know in the comments down below. But before we go, I did promise you a special collector's item. Daily Downforce fans, you could be on the track this weekend, and I don't mean just on the paint scheme, you could be literally on the track. Thomas and JD Motorsports are offering us a full set of race-used tires from Chicago. Once it comes off, it'll be signed by Thomas and Nunziata, and then Johnny Davis himself will ship it straight to your house. Johnny doesn't know about that last part yet, so just keep that between us. Don't worry, he'll be fine. This is a huge opportunity for any avid NASCAR collector or Daily Downforce fan, so be sure to check out our shop in the description down below. And as always, be sure to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and check out dailydownforce.com for more awesome NASCAR content.